Here we are for game 3, and as promised, it's another game by Anatoly Karpov against, this time defeating Judith Polgar, the then female number 1, back in Linares, the famous Linares tournament in 1994. So Karpov kicked things off with one e4, and after c5 he went for the c3 Sicilian, and then what happened is that here things changed very quickly, and d5, in my opinion, is a little bit of an unusual, perhaps not the best choice by Judith Polgar against Karpov, because Judith was a very dynamic player and a great tactician, and Karpov, of course, was a very, Judith as well. They're very well-rounded players at this level. They don't have any major weaknesses, but nevertheless, stylistically, Karpov was more of a positional grinder than Judith Polgar, who leaned more towards dynamic positions. And so Karpov, I suspect, would have been quite happy that after e takes d5, black recaptures with e takes d5, and now there's already a possibility of either hanging pawns or an IQP, because if, for example, at some appropriate moment d takes e5 happens, then after bishop takes e5, we see the presence of the isolated queen's pawn. Now, this is not the right moment to capture because it would allow black to recapture while developing. So it would give black the opportunity for faster development than white wishes. So therefore, Karpov just continued with knight f3. And after knight c6, he played the move bishop to b5. On the one hand, it may seem a little unusual that you're sort of threatening to take on c6 because it may suggest, well, if you take on c6, you're just going to give up the bishop pair. On the other hand, if one is to play, let's say, a move such as bishop to d3, there may be some issues where after c takes d4, let's say knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and c takes d4, white too has ended up with an IQP. And so this is one reason why you may wish to play bishop to b5 instead. Now, you could, of course, continue with bishop e2, but the posting of the pieces is a little bit less active, a little bit more passive. But there are other concrete reasons for bishop b5, and the point is that this pin can be quite annoying, since moves such as knight e5 and queen a4 may exert a lot of pressure on c6 before black is able to solve, in this case, her problems of development. And here, a very interesting moment has arisen. So there's a couple of common continuations here. Bishop d6 is one of them, just continuing development. And now it might make more sense to capture on c5, bishop takes c5, and now you see this potential battle against an IQP, very similar to the previous game that we just examined between Karpov and Kasparov. On the other hand, black sometimes captures. Rather than bishop d6, sometimes black will take on d4. In either case, we see that, let's say after knight takes d4, we see that in either case, black is going to emerge with this IQP. And perhaps this is what Judith wanted to avoid. And so she played this move, pawn to c4. On the one hand, this means that there is no possibility of an IQP, at least no immediate possibility of an IQP. I should say that there is absolutely a possibility of an IQP down the line. For example, if the move pawn to b3 happens, pawn takes b3 and a takes b3, we see that black would be left with an IQP. There's another point that relates to our discussion of structures. Although in structures we focused more on things like double pawns or isolated pawns, or of course IQP and hanging pawns, another thing that's worth remembering is that central pawns tend to have a greater value. There is an exception there in the endgame, but for the most part, in the opening and the middle of the game, central pawns have greater value than lateral pawns. So for example, if we notice this position here, we see that this pawn landed on c5, in fact on move 1, right? Because it was a Sicilian. And yet, if we fast forward to this particular line where black in the game plays c4, and I suggested this possibility of b3, c takes b3, and a takes b3, not only can we say that black has been left with an IQP, but we can say that black has actually lost her c-pawn after going c5, c4, in exchange, well, not for the b3 pawn, because white's b3 pawn remains, but in fact for white's a2 pawn. So it's been an effective exchange of this pawn, a c-pawn for an a-pawn, and what's more, it's been an exchange of a c-pawn for an A pawn after spending a lot of moves on that, sort of navigating with that pawn. And so it's a bad situation because you're giving up a more central pawn for a lateral pawn and you're spending a lot of time for this exchange to occur. Nevertheless, cannot know exactly what was intended after b3. Perhaps the move a6, and the point is that if, let's say, you were to retreat the bishop back to a4, then b5 would trap the bishop. And so at least in this event, bishop takes, pawn takes, and let's say if you take here and take here, on the one hand, black's structure would be completely shattered, but on the other hand, there's an argument that the bishop pair will lend quite a bit of compensation, and this double pawn situation here is maybe not quite as bad as it appears at first sight, because the possibility of c5 not only getting rid of the double pawn, but also down the line, it may be the case that this light squared bishop will be happy that there is no pawn obstructing this diagonal. In any case, to return to the game, after the move c4, which I think is a questionable move, after this move c4, white went knight e5. Karpov jumped into e5 immediately and created a concrete tactical threat here on c6. Judith defended with the move queen to b6, which is a very natural move. And here, bishop takes c6 was played. And this is a very interesting moment because on the one hand, white gives up the bishop pair, right? But although we know that this is a generally desirable positional imbalance, on the other hand, white has gotten some benefits, some clear benefits in exchange. The first, perhaps most obvious benefit is the fact that now black has doubled pawns, which as we know is generally not a very good thing. The second element is that, well, it's a little bit more subtle. The thing is that once b takes c6 has actually occurred, we see that there is a loss of flexibility along the dark squares for black. For example, take a look at this c5 square right here. The c5 square is very interesting because prior to, let's say, this whole sequence, at some point or another, this pawn on b7 could potentially go to b6 and control the c5 square. So we can't say that the c5 square is an outpost. However, after this sequence, knight e5, queen b6, bishop takes, and pawn takes, we can certainly imagine that at some point or another that c5 square could be used as an outpost because there is no b pawn and there's also no d pawn. So actually this change, this structural change here, makes the black position, it makes the pawn structure worse, and it makes black's grip on the dark squares not quite as reliable. There's also a major dynamic consideration for bishop takes c6, by the way, and that's, not positional chess, but a dynamic chess consideration. And that is that by taking, as opposed to, let's say, conserving the bishop pair with a move like bishop a4, white gains time. After this move, it would be on black to play, and, well, black could, just continue her development. With bishop takes c6, this comes in with check, b takes c6, and now white is very, very quickly able to castle. Bishop d6 is played, and here, next, in my opinion, very interesting moment. We've just mentioned that the double pawns are a problem for black, and yet Karpov, with his next move, he plays b3 and invites Judith to exchange the doubled pawns. In fact, pretty much forces Judith's hand, since there is a lot of pressure here, and black does not want to capture this knight on e5 because the dark squared bishop here, this d6 bishop, is a very important piece. Now we know that when you arrange your pawns on the light squares, especially your central pawns, you're going to have to accept a bunch of weaknesses on the dark squares. And so it really starts to make sense, this move pawn to b3, because now this diagonal has opened up. And so white is threatening the move bishop to a3, which was Karpov's idea. And if Karpov is able to exchange the dark squared bishop, then the arrangement of the pawns on the light squares, weakening the dark squares, is going to become even more problematic. Let's flip it back so that we see from the white side again. In this position, black was forced to capture on b3, and a takes b3. Now, the next comment to make here is that although on the one hand white has undoubled black's pawns, black's structure remains quite problematic. The pawn on c6 could potentially become a backward pawn, either via a move like bishop a3, which would swap off the bishops and therefore reduce black's control over the c5 square, and then you could, for example, drop the knight back in order to control with a piece the c5 square such that the pawn cannot advance. Additionally, it is also sort of semi-backwards in an indirect sense. And what I mean by this is that if black at any point pushes c5, then we'll see that there is a possibility that the c and the d pawns will be exchanged, and that would leave the d5 pawn as an isolated queen's pawn. And in general, this would be quite bad, especially since one set of minor pieces has been exchanged and a second set of minor pieces may be exchanged in the very near future. Additionally, the fact that c takes b3 and a takes b3 has occurred means that now white has gained a new semi-open file, and that semi-open file targets the isolated a pawn, which is another structural problem of black's. Therefore, I would say that the black position is already a little uncomfortable, and Judith continued with the move knight e7, which is a very logical move, simply continuing development because, of course, there is a dynamic consideration here, which is the fact that black lags a little bit in development, and her king is consequently exposed for now. Knight e7, and white correctly continues with bishop to a3. Now, in this position, black would have been more or less doing okay with a move such as knight to f5. This move makes sense because, on the one hand, you would not be taking on a3, which may help white to accelerate his development, but instead you play knight f5, inviting white to make the exchange, and the idea being that after knight takes d6, the knight here would be quite well placed. Remember that one of the potential plans for white is that this pawn on c6 be made a backward pawn by fixing the structure here with this pawn on b4. But in this event, then black's control over the c4 square would actually be very good for him, and so the knight on d6 would be sort of justified, its placement. Besides that, of course, the knight is just a very centralized piece with access to a bunch of squares and potential access to the c4 square. So this would have made a lot of sense. In my opinion, perhaps what Judith was afraid of was c4, which brings with it a very concrete threat of c5. However, black should have some ways of solving her problems here, which we won't get into just because it's more tactical sequences and calculation than positional chess. So returning to the position, but of course you can examine it in your own time if you are curious. Instead, Judith played the move bishop takes e5, and this is, in my view, a quite big mistake. So can you figure out why bishop takes e5 is a big mistake? Well, the answer is that after d takes e5, we now have opposite colored bishops on the board, but clearly the white dark squared bishop, that is a more effective piece for now. This bishop, first of all, is not developed yet, and secondly, even when it does develop, wherever it may develop, it's not actually going to have so many targets. Black did develop the bishop to e6, and now white played the move queen to d4, offering further exchanges. You might be wondering, well, doesn't that drop the pawn on b3? Well, the point of that is that if black were to accept this sacrifice, then black would have the winning sequence: bishop takes knight, king takes, rook takes pawn on a7 with check, so rook takes and queen takes is all forced. If the king steps back, let's say to e8 or to f8, then queen a8 would simply collect material. If the king steps back, by the way, I should say collect material in the sense that the rook will be skewered. If the king steps back somewhere like d8, then the presence of the king here caught along the back rank is very problematic, and white can actually just probably go for a continuation of his development, in addition to, of course, having the move queen a8 check, which with the king on d8 does allow bishop c8, but then white could just scoop up this pawn on c6, and the attack would continue and have extra material. Of course, bishop d7 is the only move that sort of seems to hang on for now. Queen c5 check, king moves, and now simply knight to d2. And the point is that, well, the material, if you count it, is even, but white's knight is going to be a more effective piece than this black bishop, and the black dark squared weaknesses, as you can see, are very severe. Of course, when you have the majority of your pawns on the light squares, and in addition, you have your light squared bishop, then you're going to be in trouble on the dark squares, more than likely, especially we notice that the white queen is well placed on a dark square that is an outpost. It cannot be harassed very easily. Queen b5, of course, would be the only way, but then white would probably play queen d6. And again, it takes time to kick out the queen. Therefore, after queen d4, Karpov is basically using tactics to offer a queen exchange. If Judith had taken, then after pawn takes queen, this is not desirable because although on the one hand, white is now left with an isolated pawn on b3, in exchange, white has connected this pawn, this c-pawn, over onto his kingside and central structure. So he now has a very, very solid pawn chain here. He has good support of e5. And additionally, when we speak of open and semi-open files, do you notice that there is now a new semi-open file has been created, and that is the c file. White is now going to be able to put pressure on that pawn on c6. And remember, we mentioned that this pawn on c6 had the potential to be made a backward pawn. And we can see that in this case, white has a very strong bind on c5. And so it has become a backward pawn. And we know we discussed this in detail in the section on pawn structures. Okay, so after queen d4, instead, black played the move knight to f5. And here it's an interesting moment because, of course, white is not going to take on b6. White will refuse to correct black's pawn structure. After a takes b6, we would see that not only has white lost his semi-open a file pressure against a7, but the worst part for white is that black has now gone from 3 pawn islands down to 2 pawn islands. We see a very, very nicely connected pawn chain here from b6, running from b6 to d5. So instead, Karpov went queen c5. And of course, the main thing that Karpov is leveraging in sort of trying to invite this exchange is the fact that Judith has yet to castle. And so this is giving serious problems. Now, at this point, things are very uncomfortable. If you play queen takes c5, bishop takes c5, we see that there's a lot of pressure here on a7. There is still no possibility to castle. Perhaps this would have been the lesser evil. Black could play something like a6 and then go king d7. And having your king in the center, at least in the absence of queens, you're probably not going to get checkmated. However, if we do play something like this, we might see the game continue something along these lines. Let's say some rook move, and now knight to b3, let's say. And we're not focusing on the very specific move order. Perhaps there is a more accurate move order, but the point that I want to show you is that in this position, sooner or later, that knight is going to occupy the c5 square, and also the rooks are going to be able to gang up along the a file against this target. This position is a position where black has no real counterplay, active counterplay, and against a player, a grinder, a technical grinder like Anatoly Karpov in his prime, this is just not where you want to be. So Judith instead opted for the move h5, which is a little bit of a cryptic move at first sight. But of course, the point is that white has the possibility of a g4 move at some point at a well-timed moment. And of course, this knight on f5 is defending queen e7. So if white can get g4 in under good terms, that would absolutely force queen takes c5. And this is something that Judith wanted to avoid. So h5 was played, and here knight went to d2. The problem is that if you're unwilling to make the exchange, you must do something about your king. And so Judith plays the move pawn to f6. Well, on the one hand, the king is going to be able to go to f7, and that's going to allow the rooks to connect. But the problem is that after e takes f6, g takes f6, the positional price that has been paid is quite significant. Not only is the king's safety being reduced, which is a more dynamic factor, but additionally, we see this pawn on f6 now having become an isolated pawn. Also, the e-file has now opened up, and it's clear that it's white that is going to be best placed to leverage that e-file and not black for the time being. White goes very slowly, bishop to b4, just improving his position. King goes to f7 and rook a4. So Karpov's plan revolves clearly around building up pressure on the semi-open a-file rather than trying to leverage the e-file. Eventually, Judith determines that she has no choice but to take on c5 and play a6. The position, however, is at this stage pretty much close to lost. And here I like the move that Karpov plays, f3. It's not strictly necessary, but it's very true to Karpov's style. He's unhurried, always unhurried with his positional advantage. If you look at his games, you'll see this time and time again. The thing about the white advantage here is that it's a very stable plus. What I mean by this is that black is not going to be able to get rid of any of his isolated pawns unless white is not going to be able to get rid of any of his isolated pawns unless white allows it. So Karpov can play prophylactically and convert his advantage patiently. Additionally, by playing f2, f3, some of black's possibilities along the light squares, remember that black is the only one with the light squared bishop, so he has an unopposed light squared bishop. Well, his play along the light squares, or rather black's play along the light squares, is going to be restricted with such a move. Finally, the king on g1 may wish to settle on f2, at which point the king will not be on this g file. So we notice that some, possible down the line, I realized that the rook is covering that square, but you never know. Down the line, rook here, knight h4, bishop h3, lots of different ways in which you could play against this point on g2 with the king on g1, but that's going to be a lot less effective with the king on f2. So finally, an additional point is that as we are now in a simplified middle game, there is a very real possibility that we're going to go into an endgame, and with a view to an endgame, it's usually a good idea to improve the centralization of your king. Black played h4, rook fa1, and bishop c8. And this is the sad part about having weaknesses that are sort of immobile. We see that this pawn, we spoke about pawn mobility some time ago in the structure section, and we see here this pawn on c6 is immobile. It's a backward pawn, and the pawn on a6 is effectively also immobile because the a5 square is a dark square under white's control. And the consequence is, of course, you cannot afford to lose too much material, so you must play such undesirable moves as bishop c8. And now the harmony of the black position has been reduced, the rooks are disconnected, and additionally, we see that the bishop has been undeveloped. White goes king f2, and now rook b8. At least the rook is no longer tied down to the defense of the a6 pawn. White now plays b4, and now truly these two pawns remain backward. Black goes rook e8 and knight b3. Notice, by the way, the work that is being done by Karpov along the dark squares. Black is completely paralyzed and simply has too many weaknesses. Let's see how the game unfolded. Bishop b7, knight went to a5. The threat is to take the bishop in order to then scoop up the pawn on a6. And if you go back to c8, the problem is that now knight takes c6 would happen. So bishop a8 was necessary. And now this bishop is pretty much the opposite of the type of bishop you want. Rook goes back to a2, rook e6, and bishop a7. Of course, rook b e8 seems like the most logical move here, and I think it would have offered a more stubborn defense. It's not clear exactly how white will break through, but I'm sure that Karpov would have found a way, perhaps with a timely retreat of the knight from a5 to b3, then on to c5, and at some point snapping up this pawn on a6. However, Judith, in an uncomfortable position, made a big mistake, rook to b5, and here is Karpov's famous tactical opportunism combined with strategic knowledge. He goes knight b3, and the point is that actually after Judith's next move, bishop to b7, this rook on b5 is going to be caught. Notice bishop b7 is a necessary move because otherwise rook takes a6, the pawn is falling. So bishop b7, the rook, however, now is lacking options. Knight d4 would be simply a crushing move because it would not only hit the rook on b5 that cannot move, but additionally it would be a fork. The knight on f5 is preventing it, so unsurprisingly Karpov went for g4. H takes g3, h takes g3. It's true that black no longer has an isolated h-pawn, but that doesn't matter. The threat is g4, and there's nothing to be done. Rook e8, g4, the knight moved, and now knight d4. The rook is lost, it's been trapped. It's notice that the only options that it could move to, the only squares it could in theory move to, are all dark squares, and we've seen that complete dark square domination by white, so nothing to be done. The rook is lost, and here, additionally, I should mention that the structural problems remain. So in addition to structural problems, you're now going to have a substantial material deficit, so black saw no reason to continue and resigned the game. That brings game 3 to a close. I hope you enjoyed this game. It had a variety of themes involved. Again, I think we touched upon a variety of themes within this game. Particularly, I would say structures, the minor piece play. We saw the superior bishop versus the rather bad bishop, so good versus bad minor piece. and a lot of exploitation of weaknesses. So we saw here a severe bind on the dark squares, which arose especially after early on in the game, this move bishop to a3, and Judith Polgar's somewhat questionable decision to capture this knight on e5, since after this, the dark square piece advantage that white enjoyed, coupled with the fact that the majority of the pawns for black were on light squares, made it an extremely difficult defense on the dark squares. And we did indeed see sort of a coordinated assault on those dark squares, a build up, and eventually culminating in a tactical blunder that accelerated defeat. But this is a very, very common pattern, right? You are put under a lot of pressure, you have a very bad position, and it's both objectively and psychologically very, very difficult to hold the position. So that brings us to the end of game 3. We're halfway through the full game series, and I shall see you in game 4, which will be featuring also Karpov, this time on the black side against a young Levon Aronian. So I hope to see you there.